The day the lawyer read my grandfather's will, every person in that room laughed. Not politely, not the kind of laughter people cover with their hands out of embarrassment or decency. This was the full, unguarded sound of people who had been waiting a long time to see someone fall and had finally at last gotten their wish. The room was small and warm. Oil lamps on the wall, dark wood paneling that smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper. Outside the single window, the town of Union, West Virginia moved through its ordinary Tuesday afternoon without any awareness that inside this office, a 16-year-old girl in a dress 2 sizes too large was standing very still while the world laughed at her. There were 4 older girls crowded in the doorway. Girls from the Clover Ridge Relief House, the place I had lived for the past 4 years. They had come, I suppose, because suffering is more entertaining when witnessed in a group. One of them, a girl named Patrice, who had made it her personal mission to remind me daily of my insignificance, actually slapped the doorframe. She was laughing so hard, her face had gone red. The 2 trustees seated along the wall exchanged a look, that particular adult smile that pretends to be sympathetic, but is really just cruelty wearing better clothes. And the lawyer himself, a thin man from Union named Mr. Aldridge, who smelled of bay rum and self-importance, looked down at his papers as though he were embarrassed to have been the one to read the words aloud. At the center of all of it stood Mrs. Ida Holt. She was the director of Clover Ridge Relief House. She had been the director for 22 years, and the institution had taken on her shape the way a house takes on the smell of whoever lives in it. She stood nearest the stove because warmth in the Clover Ridge Relief House, like everything else, belonged to rank. Her gray hair was pulled into a bun so tight it seemed to drag all the mercy off her face, pulling the skin back from her temples until she wore an expression of permanent righteous dissatisfaction with the world. When the laughter died down enough for her to be heard, she folded the letter, looked me dead in the eye, and said in that flat, certain voice she used for delivering facts she considered beyond dispute, "Well, Miss Vance, your grandfather has left you a box of wind and a house built against a grave." I was 16 years old. I stood in the middle of that room and I let the laughter wash over me like cold water, and I did not flinch, and I did not speak, and I did not look away from Mrs. Ida Holt's face. I had learned a long time ago that flinching only invited more. What I had inherited, according to the lawyer's papers, was the following 12 acres of rocky slope in Monroe County pressed against the limestone bluff at the end of a hollow called Harlan's Hollow, 3 miles south of Mercy Crossing. A cabin that local opinion held to be in serious structural decline, and a cave, a hole in the cliff face that children in the area called the White Lung because it breathed fog in summer and seemed to exhale in winter like something alive beneath the stone. The entire property had been purchased in 1867 by my grandfather Ezra Vance for $9. The auctioneer at that sale had laughed too. $9 for land that couldn't be farmed, couldn't be timbered, couldn't grow anything but reputation for poor judgment. 12 acres of nothing and a limestone hole that local people regarded as either useless or slightly unnatural, depending on how superstitious they happened to be. My grandfather had spent 31 years on that land. He had died there in 1893, 2 years before I stood in this room. He had died alone as far as anyone knew in a cabin. He had never quite gotten around to finishing on a piece of land that the county assessed at a value slightly above zero and slightly below anything worth bothering about. Everyone in the room that day agreed on one thing: Ezra Vance had been eccentric at best and frankly unhinged at worst, and whatever he had left behind in that hollow was not a gift. It was a final gesture of a peculiar man's peculiar life passed down to a granddaughter he had never met, which only went to show that eccentricity, like certain diseases, ran in families. The trustees were already standing to leave. The girls in the doorway were whispering to each other. Mrs. Holt was watching me with the thin satisfaction she always wore when the world confirmed her lowest expectations. And I stood there and felt something happen inside me that I could not name or explain. When the lawyer mentioned the cave, when he used the words "breathes in weather," something fired in my chest. Not hope exactly, not excitement, something older than both. Something that felt strangely like recognition, like hearing a word in a language you didn't know you spoke. I wanted to see a place that kept its own weather. I wanted to know why a man would spend 31 years measuring the breadth of a mountain when the whole world thought he was wasting his life. I left 4 days later. Mrs. Holt did not try to stop me. I believe she was relieved. Let me tell you who I was so you understand what I was carrying when I walked into that hollow. My father's name was George Vance. He was a timberman, which is to say he was a man who made his living in the forests of the Allegheny Mountains at a time when the logging companies were cutting everything they could reach and paying the men who cut it just enough to keep them showing up. He was not a complicated man. He worked hard. He loved my mother. He came home at the end of the day with sawdust in his hair, and he never once complained about the work, even though the work was dangerous in ways that I didn't fully understand until I was older. In the spring of 1889, I was 10 years old. A timber chain snapped on a slope above Gap Mills. It happened fast, the way these things always happen. One moment the world is ordinary, and the next moment it has been permanently rearranged. My father was gone in the way that men who work with heavy things in steep places sometimes go suddenly and without the chance to say anything to the people who needed to hear from him. My mother, whose name was Clara, held everything together for 2 years after that. She was a strong woman, the kind of strong that doesn't announce itself, that just gets up every morning and does what needs to be done without any particular expectation of recognition. She was also my grandfather Ezra's daughter, though I wouldn't understand what that meant until much later. Pneumonia came for her in the winter of 1891. She fought it for 2 seasons. The second winter, she didn't win. I was 12 years old when they buried her. I came to Clover Ridge Relief House the week after the burial, before the county had properly decided what to do with me, and I was there when they decided. From that point forward, I became what the county called a dependent, which was a polite way of saying I was a problem that needed to be distributed among people who hadn't asked for one. 3 months with my Uncle Vernon on my father's side. Vernon was a man who had found late in life that whiskey was a more reliable companion than human beings, and he had organized his existence accordingly. He sold my mother's quilt for whiskey money. When I told him I knew what he'd done, he looked at me with the particular shame of a man who has been caught by someone he doesn't respect, and 3 weeks later, he had arranged for me to be sent elsewhere. 7 months with the Bickham family. The Bickhams needed hands for milking and field work, which I provided without complaint, because I had learned by then that complaint accomplished nothing, and work at least had the satisfaction of being finite. You could finish it and know you had finished it. The Bickhams sent me away when they found me reading by lantern light after dark. They felt that a girl in my situation had no business spending lamp oil on books. I felt that a girl in any situation had every business doing exactly that, and I said so, which was my second mistake. 4 months with the Cutlip family, who returned me to Clover Ridge because I argued calmly, I thought, and with what I believed to be sound reasoning that their leaking roof needed to be patched before any further money was spent on prayer. Mrs. Cutlip found this impertinent. She was not entirely wrong, but she was not right enough to matter. And so I came back to Clover Ridge Relief House, where Mrs. Ida Holt presided over 30-some girls with the efficiency of a woman who had decided long ago that efficiency was the same thing as virtue. All told, between my first arrival after my mother's burial and my departure for Harlan's Hollow, I had spent the better part of 4 years in that institution, passed out to families, and returned, passed out, and returned again. The relief house always taking me back the way the sea takes back whatever the shore won't keep. She called my reading vanity. She called my questions impertinence. She called my habit of noticing things the way a room was organized, the way one problem connected to another, the way systems worked or failed to work, a defect of character that no decent household would tolerate. I had $1.32 to my name. I owned 1 spoon, 2 dresses, a tin of needles, and 3 books with their covers torn off that I had quietly removed from donation bins over the years. The books were a partial encyclopedia volume covering the letters G through J, a surveyor's manual from 1874 with water damage on the last 40 pages, and a collection of essays on natural philosophy that someone had thought wasn't worth keeping. I had read all 3 of them so many times I could recite passages from memory. This is who walked into Harlan's Hollow in the fall of 1895. This is what she was carrying. The wagon driver who took me south from Union was a man of few words and fewer expressions. He took me as far as the fork south of Mercy Crossing, then stopped his mules without explanation and pointed down a rutted track that disappeared into laurel and shadow. Harlan's Hollow is 3 miles that way, he said. Road gets worse before it ends. I climbed down with my carpet bag. The driver looked at me the way people look at a dog that's been left on the side of a road, not with cruelty exactly, but with the certain knowledge that whatever happened next was not his responsibility and would probably not be good. He clicked his tongue at the mules and left without wishing me well. The road did get worse. Within a quarter mile, it narrowed from wagon ruts to a single rocky track of the kind made by feet and hooves rather than wheels. The trees closed in. Tulip poplars and white oaks gave way to hemlock and rhododendron, the kind of dense, tangled growth that means poor soil and steep ground in a hollow that hasn't decided to let light in. I could hear water somewhere below me trickling through limestone, but I couldn't see it. The hollow swallowed sound, the way a mouth swallows food. I walked for 2 hours. My carpet bag handle dug into my palm until I switched hands, then dug into that palm too. The light was the low slanted light of late afternoon by the time I came through the last bend in the track and saw it. The bluff rose out of the hollow like something that had been placed there deliberately. Pale gray limestone, 60 feet of it, stained with rust where iron had leached through over the centuries, topped with a fringe of scrub pine and mountain laurel that grew at angles suggesting they had been arguing with the wind their entire lives. In the narrow confines of the hollow with the hills pressing in on both sides, the bluff didn't look like geology. It looked intentional. It looked like it had been waiting. The cabin crouched at the base of the bluff like an animal that had given up. I stood in the yard, which was mostly nettles and shale flakes, and looked at it, and the looking took something out of me. The porch sagged away from the front wall at an angle that made structural logic seem optimistic. One shutter hung by a single strap hinge, twisting in the slight breeze with a soft, rhythmic groan. The roof showed gaps where shingles had blown off seasons ago, and no one had replaced them, dark patches against the weathered wood, like wounds that had been allowed to go unattended. The chimney leaned. Someone had stacked firewood against the cabin's east wall. I could see the ghost of it, the silver-gray remains of wood that had been cut and stacked with care, maybe 10 years ago, now collapsed into a long, low mound of rot and bark in the homes of small creatures. Mouse droppings darkened the doorstep. The smell was mineral damp and old ash and something else underneath, something cold and clean that I couldn't name yet. I pushed open the door. The hinges screamed. Inside was worse than outside, but not in the way I had feared. It wasn't dirty exactly. It was simply surrendered, a room about 15 feet by 12 that had been slowly losing its argument with time and weather, and the particular loneliness of being inhabited by one old man who had other things on his mind. An iron bedstead with a straw tick mattress. A table with one leg shorter than the others, propped with a flat stone. A stove with a cracked firebox plate. A single shelf on the east wall holding 3 empty glass jars. And on the bed, folded with a neatness so deliberate it broke something open in my chest, a wool blanket. Precisely folded. Square corners. As though someone had believed until the very last that neatness could hold back the ruin of everything else. Ezra Vance had died orderly. That made it sadder. I set my carpet bag on the table and stood in the fading light and looked at the room that was now by law in letter mine. Through the gaps in the shutters, I could see the bluff. And at the base of the bluff, half hidden by laurel and wind-thrown stone, I could see the darker shadow. A hole in the rock. A mouth. The cave. I was 16 years old. I had $1.32. I had no family anywhere in the world who would claim me. I had been placed and returned and placed again like a piece of furniture that didn't quite fit any room it was put in. And I had inherited a cabin that was falling down at the foot of a cliff that everyone in Monroe County agreed was good for nothing. I sat down on the bed. The ropes creaked under my weight. I did not cry. I had stopped crying the year my mother died. Crying requires the belief that someone might hear you. I had lost that belief a long time ago, and I had not missed it as much as I might have expected. But I did not sleep that night either. I lay on the mouse-eaten mattress and listened to the wind come through the walls, through gaps I couldn't see in the dark, finding its way in the way wind always does, patient and without malice, simply going where it was not stopped. I listened to the cabin settle and groan, adjusting itself to the cold the way old things do. And I thought about Mrs. Ida Holt's face when she read the will. A box of wind, a house built against a grave. She had been so certain it was a cruel joke. A final eccentric insult from a man everyone had agreed was not quite right, delivered to a granddaughter he had never met, as though the most appropriate inheritance for a girl with nothing was officially confirmed nothing. Lying there in the dark, I thought she might be right. But something about the cave kept coming back to me. The way the lawyer had said it breathes in weather. The way it had fired something in my chest that I still couldn't name. A place that kept its own weather. I wanted to know why. The next morning, I tried to make the place livable. I stuffed rags into the gaps in the walls. I swept out the mouse droppings with a bundle of hemlock branches. I found a tin bucket with only one hole in it and walked a quarter-mile to a spring that ran thin and cold from between two flat rocks. The water tasted of iron and limestone minerals that had been dissolving into it for a very long time, giving it a taste that was strange at first, and then, after a few days, simply became the taste of water. I had brought a small sack of cornmeal from the Clover Ridge stores, taken without asking, because Mrs. Holt had never given me anything I hadn't taken for myself. I mixed it with spring water and cooked it into mush on the cracked stove, managing the heat carefully to keep smoke from pouring back through the damaged firebox. I ate it with my one spoon. It was not enough. It would not be enough for long. But that was a problem for later. The cabin required my attention first. I was on my hands and knees checking the floor for gaps that cold air might come through when I found it. A floorboard near the bed sounded different. I had stepped on it that morning and registered the sound without consciously noting it, a hollow thunk, where the rest of the floor gave solid creaks. Now moving systematically across the planks, the way I moved through any problem I was trying to understand, I stopped on that board and stood still and pressed down gently with my heel. Hollow. Definitely hollow. I got down on my knees and looked at it. The board was loose, not rotted loose, not the looseness of neglect, but deliberately loose. Someone had pried it up and set it back without nailing it down. The edges showed the marks of a tool. The marks were old, but deliberate. I worked my fingers under the edge and lifted. Underneath was a cavity in the space between the joists, lined on all sides with oilcloth, dark treated cloth that kept moisture out. The oilcloth had been tucked and folded at the corners with the same precise care as the blanket on the bed. Inside the oilcloth was a package wrapped so carefully that the wrapping itself felt like a statement. My hands were shaking. I couldn't entirely account for why. Something about the care of it, the deliberateness of the hiding, the sense that someone had put this here because it mattered enormously to them and had then died before they could explain what it was or why. I lifted it out. I set it on the table. I unwrapped the oilcloth. Inside were 14 ledger books. Each one was approximately the size of a church hymnal. Each was numbered on the spine in lamp black 1 through 14, in a hand that was small and precise, the numbers just large enough to read clearly. Some of the books had swelled with damp, their pages wavy at the edges. Others were still tight and dry. Underneath the books were 2 thermometers in carved wooden cases, a brass compass with a hairline crack across the face glass, and a tin of carpenter's pencils sharpened to fine points that had never been used. I picked up the first ledger. The spine said 1. I opened it to the first page. The handwriting was small and cramped, slanting slightly to the right, but entirely readable. It was the handwriting of a man who had a great deal to say and had learned to say it in a small space. October 12th, 1867. Arrived at Harlan's Hollow. Purchased the tract at public auction for $9. The auctioneer laughed when I paid. He said I had bought exactly $9 worth of nothing, which is possibly true in conventional terms. But there is a cave here, and I have questions about caves. I believe the questions are worth $9 at minimum. I sat down on the floor. The boards were cold through my dress. I kept reading. Ezra Vance had been a school teacher in the valley before the war. He had taught mathematics and natural science to the children of farmers who needed their children back for harvest and planting, and who regarded education as a seasonal activity, useful in the slow months and a luxury at all other times. He had been, by his own account, a decent teacher and a better observer, a man whose particular gift was noticing patterns that other people walked past. He had come back from the war with something altered in him that made him need silence more than company. This was not unusual in the years after the war. Many men came back changed in ways their families and neighbors found difficult to understand or accommodate. But most of those men eventually found their way back into the ordinary shape of things: farms, families, churches, the comfortable routine of a life organized around the seasons and the expectations of a community. Ezra Vance had not done that. Instead, he had read something about caves. The specific book was a surveyor's report from the Greenbrier Valley, badly printed and intended for a professional audience, which had mentioned in passing that limestone cave systems often maintained remarkably stable internal temperatures regardless of surface conditions. The author of the report had noted this as a curiosity and moved on. Ezra Vance had stopped at that sentence and stayed there for a long time. He bought the Harlan's Hollow tract because it was cheap and far from other people, and because it had a cave. The first 5 ledgers were observation records. 31 years of them, and every morning without exception, Ezra had measured the temperature at 3 points the mouth of the cave, 50 feet inside and 100 feet inside. He had recorded the outside temperature at the same times. He had noted wind direction, humidity estimated by the behavior of his hair and the behavior of the morning fog and the phase of the moon. He had burned smoke pots at the cave mouth and recorded which direction the smoke moved and how quickly and whether the direction changed at different times of day. And he had found something that nobody else in Monroe County knew about or had thought to look for. In summer, cool air flowed out of the cave during the day because the deep rock insulated from the surface by hundreds of feet of stone above and around it stayed cooler than the air outside. In winter, the reverse was true. Warmer air flowed out at night because the deep rock stayed warmer than the bitter cold that settled into the hollow. The direction of flow changed with the seasons, with the time of day, with the weather. It was reliable. It was measurable. It was Ezra had come to believe after years of watching it predictable. The cave breathed, exactly as the children said it did. The children were right, though they didn't know why. But Ezra knew why, or he had taught himself to understand why over years of reading and measuring and writing down what he observed and comparing it to what he had read and what he observed the following season. The cave breathed because of physics. He didn't use that word. He wrote about stone memory and mountain steadiness and the way deep rock held the average temperature of the year, like a man holds a thought not subject to the noise of any particular day, but the accumulated truth of all the days together. But what he meant was this: far enough into the limestone past the first chamber and into the passages beyond the rock held a temperature close to the yearly average of the region. Summer didn't heat it much. Winter didn't cool it much. It simply stayed there, patient and indifferent, at 52 or 53 or 54 degrees year after year after year. And Ezra Vance had spent 31 years wondering a single question. What if you could borrow that steadiness? Ledgers 6 through 9 were maps, hand-drawn cross-sections of the cave with arrows indicating observed airflow numbers, recording temperatures at different depths across different seasons, diagrams of the cracks in the bluff face through which the cave communicated with the outside air. The maps were meticulous. They were the work of a man who understood that seeing clearly required recording carefully. Ledgers 10 through 12 were something else entirely. Construction plans. Ezra had designed something he called a winter throat, an enclosed corridor connecting the cabin to the mouth of the cave, sealed at both ends with fitted doors and controlled in the middle by a baffle vent whose opening could be adjusted like a damper. The principle was straightforward but strange. Instead of fighting the cold entirely with fire and wood, which were expensive and finite and required constant tending, he wanted to connect the cabin's air to the cave's air. Let the mountain's steadiness buffer the cabin against the killing cold of February. Let the stone do some of the work that wood and fire did alone. He had begun to build it. Ledger 12 contained sketches of stone footings he had laid at the cave mouth, 2 courses of flat limestone, carefully leveled, forming the base for walls that had never been built. He had measured the porch boards and determined that 14 of them were exactly the right length for the corridor walls. He had sketched a door frame and a baffle vent and a ceiling system using lime mortar and strips of linen. He had calculated the lumber he would need for the frame and where it could be cut from the surrounding forest. He had been dismantling his own porch to build the corridor. And then he had died. I put the 12th ledger down and sat quietly for a moment. Outside, the light was changing, the thin pale light of a fall afternoon in a deep hollow, the kind of light that starts going early and doesn't apologize for it. I had been reading for hours. My back ached. My candle was burning low. I picked up the 13th ledger. It was a winter log. The winter of 1892 to 1893, the last full winter Ezra had survived. He had recorded temperatures, wood consumption, the state of his food stores. He had written in a passage near the end that he felt the project was close, that the footings were solid, that the porch boards were ready, that he intended to begin building the quarter walls in the spring. He had written, "I believe this will work. I have believed this for 26 years, and I believe it more, not less, as the evidence accumulates. I am not a stubborn man. A stubborn man holds a belief against evidence. I hold this belief because of evidence." That is a different thing entirely, though. I have found that most people are unable to see the distinction. I put the 13th ledger down. I picked up the 14th. This one was different from the others. Where the earlier ledgers were dense with numbers and observations and diagrams, this one held something else. Letters, or the drafts of letters, letters addressed to my mother who had left this hollow as a young woman, had married a timberman named George Vance, and had died of pneumonia in the winter of 1891 before she could ever come back. Letters to the daughter she had left behind. Letters to me. I found it on the 3rd page. The handwriting was the same small, cramped script, but slower here, more careful, as though each word had been considered before it was committed to the page. To the child who still asks why. I do not know if you will ever come here. I do not know if you will ever read this. But I want you to know, if you do that, I was not crazy. I was patient. There is a difference, and it matters. A crazy man chases things that aren't there. A patient man waits for things that are there but haven't shown themselves yet. The mountain keeps its own time. It does not answer quickly. But if you learn how to ask it, and asking means watching, and watching means recording, and recording means being willing to see what is actually there rather than what you expected to see. If you do all of that, it will answer. What the mountain keeps steady will keep you alive if you learn how to ask it. I sat on the floor of that cabin in the fading afternoon light, and I held that page in both hands, and I did not move for a long time. Someone like me had come before. Someone who noticed things. Someone who asked why and kept asking past the point where other people had grown impatient with the question. Someone who had looked at a worthless piece of rocky ground at the bottom of a hollow and seen not what it was, but what it could mean if you were willing to be patient and willing to be thought foolish and willing to spend 31 years on a question that the world considered not worth asking. I was not going to let the world be right about him. The sound came from outside, a single footstep on the shale of the yard, then silence. I was on my feet before I had consciously decided to move the 14th ledger still in my hand. The door was not locked. There was no lock on it. I crossed the room and pulled it open. A man stood at the edge of the yard in the shadow of the tree line where the hemlock came close to the cabin. He was old 70 at least, perhaps more. His hair was white and thin under a battered felt hat. One eye was clouded with cataract, the iris barely visible under a film of white. The other eye was dark and sharp, the kind of sharp that comes from spending decades learning to compensate the eye of a man who had learned to see twice as much with what remained to him. His hands hanging at his sides were large and scarred and white in the creases, in a way I had seen before on men who worked with stone lime dust, worked into the skin until it became part of it. His coat was old and patched and had been good once. He stood without moving, watching me with that single dark eye. "I've been watching your smoke," he said. His voice was low and deliberate, the voice of a man who chose his words carefully and was not in any hurry to use more of them than necessary. "For how long?" I said. "Few days. Wasn't sure who was up here. Figured eventually I'd find out." He took a step forward, not fast-moving, with the careful steadiness of a man whose body had its opinions about movement and had learned to negotiate with them. He stopped at the edge of the porch. What remained of the porch, the surviving boards gray with age, and looked at me with the unsentimental directness of a man who had lived long enough to see no point in pretense. "You're the granddaughter," he said. It was not a question. "Nora Vance." "Cormac Briggs. I live down the hollow about a mile." He looked past me into the cabin, his dark eye moving over the ledgers on the table, the open 14th book in my hand. "Ezra's journals? Found them, did you?" "Under the floor." "He put them there in '92, worried about the weather getting to them." He paused. "Or other people." Something in the way he said it made me look at him more carefully. "He played checkers with me on Sunday afternoons," Cormac said when he'd come down from this hollow, which wasn't often but regular. A pause. "He talked about you, More than you might expect for a man who'd never met you. My throat did something complicated. I waited. He sent a letter to your relief house, Cormac said, after your mother passed, 1891. He looked at me steadily. Sent money with it. $10. Train fare and wagon fare enough to get a child from Union out to the Hollow. The world got very quiet. He wanted you here, Cormac said. Wanted you to know this place. Know what he had been doing. I looked at him for a long moment. The letter arrived at Clover Ridge, I said. My voice came out flat and even. I had learned to make my voice do that when what was happening inside me was not flat and not even. It just didn't arrive to me. Cormac looked at me. He understood immediately. I could see it in his face, not surprise exactly, but the specific lack of surprise of a man who has spent a long life watching powerful people make quiet decisions and that less powerful people have no knowledge of and no recourse against. Mrs. Ida Holt, he said, yes. The silence between us held the full weight of what that meant. Ezra Vance had sent for me in 1891. He had sent money. He had wanted his granddaughter to come to Harlan's Hollow to learn what he had spent 31 years learning to be here with him at the end of something he had given his life to. Mrs. Ida Holt had made a decision. She had kept the letter. She had kept the money. I didn't know what she'd done with it then, though. I would find out, and she had said nothing to me. 4 more years in the Clover Ridge Relief House. 4 more years of being told my questions were impertinence, and my reading was vanity, and my noticing things was a defect of character. 4 years that should have been spent here. I looked at the 14th ledger in my hand, the page with my grandfather's letter to the child who still asks why. He had died in 1893. 2 years after he sent for me. He had died waiting. There's something else, Cormac said. He moved to the stone footings at the cave mouth. I could see them now from the doorway half buried in leaf litter, the 2 courses of flat limestone that Ezra had laid in 1892. Cormac stood beside them and looked at them with the eye of a man who understood stonework. Ezra came to me about these. I was a stonemason once before the quarry dust got into my lungs. I helped him lay the lintel. He pointed to a flat stone set across the top of the cave mouth, a single piece of shaped limestone deliberately cut, forming the header of a door frame that had never held a door. That stone's been waiting 3 years. He was quiet for a moment. Douglas Pruitt came to see Ezra, he said, more than once. The name meant nothing to me yet, but the way Cormac said it told me something. Who is Douglas Pruitt? Man who owns the wood yard in Mercy Crossing, holds notes on about half the farms in this valley. When a family has a hard winter and they need credit to get through it, they go to Douglas Pruitt. And when they can't pay, Douglas Pruitt takes their land. Cormac looked at the cave mouth, at the lintel stone, at the unbuilt quarter that existed only in a dead man's ledgers. He came to Ezra 3 times in the last 10 years. Each time he offered more money for this tract. How much? Started at $12. Last time I know of, he'd gone to $22. $22 for land Ezra had paid $9 for, more than double, for land that by every conventional measure had no value. Ezra always refused, Cormac said. Why did Pruitt want it? Cormac was quiet for a moment, the way a man is quiet when he's deciding how much to say. Ezra wrote it in his 13th ledger, he said finally. Last entry near the end, he wrote, I do not know exactly what Pruitt sees in this land. I know only that he wants it more than a man should want something worthless. And I know this, a man who wants something that badly has seen something in it that the seller hasn't recognized yet. Cormac looked at me. Ezra didn't know what Pruitt saw, but he knew better than to sell to a man who wanted it that badly. He wrote it plain, never sell to the man who wants to buy too fast. I stood in the doorway of the cabin and looked at the cave mouth and the waiting lintel stone and the stone footings where an old man had started building something he never finished. The light was going. The hollow was filling with the blue-gray shadow that comes early in deep places. The breath of the cave was barely visible now, just a slight disturbance in the cooling air, a shimmer at the mouth of the rock. Cormac Briggs walked to the remnants of the porch, the few boards still attached to the cabin wall, gray with age, the nails rust-red and old, and reached down and picked up one of the longer planks. He turned it in his hands, checking it the way a craftsman checks lumber grain, straightness, soundness. Your grandfather understood what this cave could do, he said. He spent 31 years proving it on paper. He just couldn't make his hands do what his head knew. He set the plank down across the stone footings. He could design the thing. He couldn't build it. He looked at me with his one dark eye. I can build, he said, but I didn't understand not the way he understood. Between the two of us, we had one complete person. We just never figured out how to share it right. He paused. That was Ezra's way of putting it. The hollow had gone quiet around us. In the distance, somewhere up on the ridge, a single bird called once and was answered by silence. The cave breathed. I could feel it from where I stood, the slight movement of air out of the dark mouth of the rock. Cool and clean and constant, the exhalation of something enormous and patient that had been doing this since before anyone had thought to pay attention to it. I can't build anything, I said. I've never built anything more complicated than a cornhusk doll. Cormac picked up the plank again. I know, he said. That's why I'm here. Cormac Briggs arrived the next morning before the light had fully come into the hollow. I heard him before I saw him, the careful, deliberate footsteps of a man who had learned to pace himself against his own body's resistance. By the time I had the stove going and the first thin thread of smoke climbing from the chimney, he was standing at the cave mouth, his leather satchel open on the stone footings, laying out his tools with the quiet precision of a man performing a ritual he had performed 10,000 times before. A carpenter's square. A level its glass bubble centered in a brass case worn smooth from years of handling. An auger with 3 different bits each wrapped in oilcloth. A froe for splitting. A mallet with a hickory handle darkened by decades of use. A trowel. I brought him a cup of hot water. I had no coffee, no tea, nothing to put in it, and he accepted it without comment and drank it as though it were exactly what he had wanted. We start with the frame, he said. Posts first. Everything else follows from the posts. How do we get the posts? He pointed to the tree line at the edge of the clearing, where a stand of young tulip poplars grew close together, competing for light. Those second-growth, straight-grain, tight rings. Poplar splits clean if you know what you're doing. I don't know what I'm doing. I know. Watch. He was not a man who wasted words on encouragement, and I came to understand quickly that this was its own form of respect. He showed me how to select a trunk the right diameter, the absence of visible crook or twist in the grain, the sound it made when you struck it with the flat of your hand. He showed me how to score the bark in a straight line top to bottom and work the froe along the score until the wood began to give. He split one post from start to finish without speaking, just the sounds of the work. The mallet striking the froe head, the long tearing release of wood fiber, finding its grain, the clean smell of new-cut poplar rising in the cold air. Then he handed me the mallet. I split the next post badly. The froe wandered from the grain, and the wood twisted, giving me a piece that curved along its length like a question mark. Why, I said, you started straight, but you stopped watching the grain when it turned. The grain tells you where to go. You have to follow it, not force it. I split another. Better. The grain ran mostly true, and I followed it, adjusting the angle of the froe when I felt the resistance change the way you adjust the tiller of a boat when the current shifts beneath you. Better, Cormac said, which I would learn was the highest form of praise he used. We worked through that first week in a cold that got worse each day, the temperature dropping in increments that were polite in their patience and merciless in their accumulation. By the end of the week, we had 8 posts split and rough trimmed, standing upright in holes we had dug into the earth between the stone footings and the cabin's front wall. The posts were set plumb. Cormac checked each one with the level, making small adjustments, tamping stone chips around the base to correct the angle, checking again until the bubble sat precisely where it needed to sit. Your grandfather set these footings well, Cormac said one afternoon, crouching over the limestone courses Ezra had laid in 1892. He ran his fingers along the joints, checking for movement. Dry laid but tight, he had a good eye for flat stone. He had a good eye for everything, and I said, just not the hands to follow through. Cormac looked at me. He said that about himself, almost exactly those words. He stood his knees, complaining at the transition. He wasn't wrong. Some people are built to understand. Some people are built to build. Ezra was a rare man. He understood more than most people ever would. He just needed someone to translate the understanding into wood and stone. And he never had that. He had me, for the thinking part on Sunday afternoons, but I couldn't follow him far enough into the theory to do what you're doing now, reading those journals. He looked at me steadily. How much of it do you understand? Most of it, I said. The physics of it, the way dense stone holds temperature, the way air flows from high pressure to low, from warm to cold, from inside to outside, depending on the season. The reason the cave breathes in different directions at different times. I paused. I didn't know the formal words for any of it before I read his journals, but I understood the logic. Cormac nodded slowly. Then you're more than half of what we need. The crossbeams went up in the second week. Horizontal members connecting the 8 posts braced at the corners with angled struts tying the whole frame into a structure that could resist the weight of a roof and the push of winter wind. Cormac showed me how to cut the mortise joints that locked the beams to the posts, the chisel work the mallet control required to cut a true square hole in wood without splitting the surrounding grain. My first 3 mortises were too large. My 4th was close. My 5th he looked at for a long moment and then moved to the next post without comment, which I had learned meant it was acceptable. By the end of the second week, the skeleton stood, 20 feet long, 5 feet wide, 8 posts cross-beamed and braced, connecting the cave mouth to the spot where the cabin's front door would eventually open into this passage. It looked like the bones of something a creature assembled from lumber and intention, waiting to be given skin. Now the walls, Cormac said. We nailed the boards horizontally across the outside of the posts, working from the bottom up. Each board lapped slightly over the one below it, like the scales of a fish shedding water down and away from the interior. The boards were the old porch lumber, gray and weathered on the outside face, but still sound in the grain, giving up their decades of outdoor service for this new purpose. They went up faster than I expected. There was something deeply satisfying about the rhythm of it, the alternation of holding and hammering, the way the wall grew solid and real before my eyes. The roofing took 3 days. Cormac showed me how to run the boards across the top of the frame at an angle that would shed snow, how to double layer them, and seal the joint with a mixture of pine pitch and hemlock bark that he heated in an old tenon over the stove until it ran liquid and then spread with a stick while it was still warm. When the roof was on and the walls were closed, I stood inside the corridor for the first time and felt the difference immediately. Outside, the wind moved. Inside the corridor, it did not. The temperature was not warm. Nothing about those November days was warm, but it was less cold than the open air, the walls blocking the wind's ability to carry heat away from anything that stood within them. Now the ceiling, Cormac said. This is where it matters. He had brought a small barrel of quicklime from his kiln shed down the hollow lime he had burned himself from limestone the previous summer. We mixed it with sand and water in careful proportions that he measured by hand, by feel, by the particular way a trowel moved through the mixture. Too dry and it wouldn't adhere. Too wet and it would crack as it dried. The right consistency, he said, was like Cold Creek mud, heavy enough to hold its shape when you picked it up, soft enough to work into a seam and pack down tight. We stuffed the joints between the boards with strips of linen, first old cloth I had cut from one of my extra dresses, the one that was beyond saving as a garment, working it into the gaps with a flat stick until it was packed solid. Then the mortar went over. It applied with the trowel in smooth strokes, filling the remaining gaps and sealing the linen in place. It took 3 days. By the end, my hands had cracked along the knuckles from the lime draws, moisture from skin, the way it draws moisture from everything, and the cold made the cracks open and bleed. I wrapped them in strips of the same linen at night and unwrapped them each morning and kept working. When we had sealed the walls and set the 2 doors, one at the cave end, one at the cabin end, each hung on iron hinges Cormac had brought from his shed, I stood in the middle of the corridor and felt the quality of the air inside it change. The wind that had been a constant presence in the hollow, a voice in every gap and joint, went silent. Now we find out, Cormac said. He opened the cave door. I felt nothing at first. Then slowly, subtly, a movement of air, cool but not cold. The cave's exhalation moving through the door we had made for it, filling the corridor with the particular quality of air that had been resting in deep limestone for a very long time. Cool and clean and carrying the faint mineral taste of the stone itself. Cormac hung a thermometer on the corridor wall. We watched it. 51 degrees, 52. It settled there. Outside, the air was in the high 20s. Inside the corridor, 52 degrees and still. Not warm. But the difference between killing cold and something a human body could endure was not warmth. It was the absence of the wind's particular cruelty, the steady temperature that didn't plunge through the night, the buffer between flesh and the worst that winter could do. "It's working," I said. Cormac said nothing. He looked at the thermometer for a long time. Then he said, "Not yet proven. Wait for a hard night." The hard night came in the second week of December. The temperature dropped faster than the days before it had suggested it would, the way hard cold often arrives in Appalachian hollows, not gradually but all at once, as though the season had been waiting for the right moment to announce itself without ambiguity. I closed the cabin door and opened the corridor door and kept the stove burning small, a cautious fire just enough to take the worst edge off the cabin's air, and went to bed with the wool blanket Ezra had left folded on the iron bedstead and 2 additional layers of my own clothing, and I waited. I woke in the night to the sound of the wind. It was loud, a sustained, organized sound from the north, finding the hollow and pushing down through it with the force of something that had been building for a long distance. The cabin shook at the corners. The shutters rattled. Through the gaps I had not yet sealed in the cabin walls, I could feel the cold reaching in, probing, looking for a way through, finding small passages and expanding them with each gust. And then I heard it, a whistling, not the random sound of wind through a gap, a focused, sustained, high-pitched sound from the direction of the corridor wall. I got out of bed. The cold of the floor came through my socks immediately. I crossed to the corridor door and opened it. The corridor was full of smoke. Not cave smoke, the cave had no fire in it. This was the stove smoke from the cabin drawn backward through the firebox by the cross draft that was now running through the corridor. A seam had opened in the corridor wall. I could hear the wind coming through it, a sustained whistle that had moved from unnoticeable to significant the moment the north wind found it. The cold outside air was being pulled in through that gap. The warmer air from the cave was being disrupted, and the resulting pressure change had reversed my stove's draft and pulled smoke directly into the living space. I was coughing before I made it back to the cabin door. I threw it open and stumbled out into the night and stood in the cold with tears streaming from smoke-irritated eyes that were not crying. And I looked at the corridor I had spent 6 weeks building, and for a long moment I said nothing and thought nothing and simply stood in the dark and breathed. Cormac found me like that an hour later when he came up from his cabin to check on things as he had started doing on nights when the weather turned hard. He stood beside me and looked at the smoke still wisping from the gap in the corridor wall visible in the moonlight. "Too thick," he said without preamble. "The mortar. We put it on too thick in sections and it dried fast in the cold and contracted. Cracked at the thickest places." "I know. We'll strip it and do it again. Thinner. Each layer has to cure before the next goes on." "How long will that take?" 3 days, maybe 4, in this cold." He looked at me. "Warmer in my cabin. You could stay down there." "No," I said. "This is where the work is." He nodded. He had, I think, expected that answer. 3 days of chipping out the cracked mortar, the sound of it in the cold air, a patient rhythmic work that gave the hands something to do while the mind processed the failure and began planning the correction. The lime mortar came away in curved chips where it had contracted and released the wall. In the places where we had applied it thin and even it had held. The failure was precisely where Cormac had identified it. The thick sections applied in a single pass had dried unevenly and cracked along the stress lines of their own contracting weight. We resealed in thin coats. 3 passes on each joint, each one allowed to cure to the touch before the next was applied. The work was slower. The result was different, not just visually, but in the way the wall sounded when I ran my knuckle along it. Solid. No hollow note where air was waiting to find a path through. When we finished, the temperature had dropped further. The creek a quarter-mile down the hollow had frozen at its edges, the moving water in the center still visible between borders of ice. The birds in the tree line had gone quiet in the particular way birds go quiet when the cold is serious and not interested in negotiation. I closed both corridor doors. I built a small fire in the stove. I waited until the stove was drawing correctly, the smoke going up and out as it should, the cabin warming slowly in the way. A poorly insulated room with a cracked firebox plate warms, which is to say imperfectly, but definitively. Then I opened the corridor door. The air that came through was different from the cabin's air. I felt it before I measured it, a quality of stillness, a steadiness, the particular absence of malice that characterizes air that has been sitting in deep limestone for a very long time before being asked to do anything. The thermometer on the corridor wall read 53 degrees. Outside it was 11 degrees and falling. The difference between 11 and 53 is 42 degrees. But the real difference was not the number. The real difference was what that meant for a human body trying to sleep in a small room connected to that corridor with a modest fire and the stone's breath, doing the work that the fire alone could not do cheaply enough to sustain through a long winter. I left the corridor door open a crack. I built the stove fire down to coals. I went to bed. I woke before the light came into the hollow. The habit of early waking had been with me since childhood. My body's own system calibrated by years of institutional life where the morning was the only time that belonged entirely to you before the day organized itself around other people's requirements. The cabin was cold, cold enough that I could see my breath in the dark, a small cloud forming and dissolving with each exhalation. I lay still for a moment and listened to the wind, which had continued through the night and was still talking in the tree line above the bluff. To the cabin, which was making its habitual sounds of contraction, wood tightening against the cold. To the corridor, which was silent. I got out of bed. The floor took the warmth from my feet immediately. I crossed to the wash basin, the same cracked clay basin that had been in the cabin when I arrived, sitting on the short shelf near the east wall, and looked at it. The water was liquid. I stood and stared at it for a long time. Outside, the temperature was somewhere below 10 degrees. I had checked the outdoor thermometer before bed, and it had been at 14 and dropping. The creek edges had frozen solid 2 days ago. The spring I drew water from had developed an ice shelf that I had to break each morning to get at the water beneath. But the water in the wash basin, which sat in a room that was connected through an open door to a corridor that was connected to a cave that held 53 degrees of mountain-steady air, was liquid. Cold. I could see the small crystals forming at the edges where it touched the clay, but liquid. Moving. Alive. I walked to the corridor door. I had left it open a crack, and through the crack I could feel what had been there all night. Patient and unremarked, the breath of the mountain flowing through the door we had made for it, filling the corridor with its steady temperature and keeping the cabin air from plunging to the depth where water freezes and pipes burst, and old people in poorly insulated houses do not wake up in the morning. I opened the door fully and stepped into the corridor. The air wrapped around me. Not warm, I was still wearing everything I owned, and I did not take any of it off. But the quality of the cold was different here. It was the cold of a temperature in the 40s, not the cold of a temperature in the teens. A cold you could stand in, a cold that did not feel like it was trying to do something to you. I put my hand on the corridor wall and held it there. Through the boards, through the mortar, through the wood of the framing posts, I could feel, or believed I could feel, which may have been the same thing, the stone footings beneath. The limestone that Ezra had laid in 1892 and that I had built upon. The mass of the bluff behind them, 60 feet of rock that had been sitting in this hollow since before the last ice age, holding its temperature, the way it held everything patiently, indifferently, with the absolute steadiness of something that has never been in a hurry. I thought about Ezra Vance writing in his first ledger on October 12, 1867. The auctioneer laughed when I paid. He said I had bought exactly $9 worth of nothing. I thought about 31 years of mornings like this one, checking temperatures, recording numbers, asking a question that nobody else thought was worth asking. I thought about a letter sent in 1891 and a woman with a gray bun who had kept it, and 4 years of being told that noticing things was a defect of character. I put my face in my hands and I laughed once, a single involuntary sound, and then I cried, for the first time since my mother died. Real crying, the kind that doesn't make a sound, that is purely physical. The body releasing something it has been holding compressed for too long. I stood in the corridor with my face in my hands and let it happen. When I took my hands away, the air was the same. 52 degrees. Steady, patient, entirely indifferent to whether I cried or didn't cry, whether I was 16 or 60, whether I had $1.32 or $1,320. The mountain did not care about any of that. It just kept what it kept. I heard Cormac's footsteps on the shale outside. A moment later, his face appeared at the quarter's cave-in door, which I had left open, and he stepped inside and stood looking at the thermometer on the wall. His breath made a small cloud. He looked at the number. He looked at me. 53 degrees, he said. 52 when I came in. He was quiet for a moment. The particular quiet of a man who has been carrying something for a long time and has just set it down. Ezra was right, he said finally. He was right about all of it. A pause. And you built it. He built it. He sat down beside me on the corridor floor slowly, his joints negotiating the descent, and we sat there together in the mountain's breath, in the steady air that had been waiting in Limestone for longer than either of us had been alive, and for the first time since I had walked into Harlan's Hollow with a carpet bag and $1.32 in a dead man's ledgers, I felt like I might not die here. The winter of 1895 to 1896 passed. But he came when he could, and we spent those days making adjustments, refining the baffle vent in the middle of the corridor, learning how to read the airflow, the way a sailor reads a sail, feeling when the balance between cave air and cabin air needed to shift. Too much cave air, and you cooled the cabin below what the stove could compensate for. Too little, and you lost the benefit of the mountain's steadiness. The right balance was a living thing changing with the outside temperature, with the wind direction, with the time of day. I learned to read it. I learned the feel of the corridor when it was working correctly, the particular quality of the air movement, slow and steady, the cave breath mixing with the cabin's warmer air in a way that moderated both without overwhelming either. I learned the sound it made when the balance was off, a very slight variation in the way the baffle moved, a barely perceptible change in the temperature at the corridor's midpoint, and I learned to correct it before it became a problem. The mountain was talking. I was learning its language. Spring came, and with it the first real evidence that what Ezra had designed and what I had built was more than a way to survive a winter. It was a way to change the nature of what the hollow could do. In June, I began storing vegetables in the alcove just inside the cave mouth, where Ezra's maps had indicated the temperature stayed closest to the deep stone's 53 degrees. Potatoes went in first in wooden crates I had built from the last salvageable lumber from the collapsed firewood stack. Then onions braided and hanging from the alcove ceiling. Turnips packed in dry sand in a clay crock. In July, Cormac came up to see how it was working. He reached into the potato crate and picked one up and turned it in his hands. Good, he said. No eyes, still firm. It's July, I said. Potatoes are easy in July. Come back in September. He came back in September. The potatoes he picked up looked as though they had been dug the previous week. The onions showed no sign of spoilage. The turnips in the sand-packed crock were perfect. He sat down on the stone footings and looked at what the cave had done to 4 months of stored food, which was in essence nothing at all, which was exactly the point. You know what this means, and he said, it means I have vegetables through the winter. It means more than that. I knew what he meant. I had known since July. A cool, steady environment that doesn't rot food or sprout potatoes or turn onions soft, that's not just a way to feed one person. That's a resource. That's something other people need, especially in a valley where winter traditionally converted whatever you hadn't managed to preserve in brine or smoke into compost. 3 miles up the road in Mercy Crossing, a woman named Mabel Cobb ran the General Mercantile with her husband Percy. She was not a warm woman. She was practical in the particular way of someone who has run a business in a small town for a long time and has developed a working theory of human nature based on what people buy and when and how urgently. Her face was angular, her voice direct, and she had the merchant's gift for assessing value without sentiment. I walked the 3 miles into Mercy Crossing on a Tuesday in September, carrying a basket of potatoes and a string of onions. Mabel Cobb looked at the potatoes the way she looked at everything with calibrated, unsentimental attention. She picked one up, turned it, pressed a thumb gently against its surface. These came from your place, she said. From the Vance Hollow. Yes. Dug when at y'all's July. She looked at the potato again. It's September. I know when it is. She set the potato down. She looked at the string of onions. She looked at me. She was running calculations behind her eyes that I could almost see, not just the price of potatoes in September, which was elevated because most July dug potatoes were long since soft or sprouted, but the larger implication of a person who could offer September quality vegetables from a July harvest. 2 cents each for the potatoes, she said. 7 cents for the onions by the string. It was not charity, it was not even kindness. It was business, which was the only language Mabel Cobb spoke fluently, and it told me more than kindness would have. She was paying a premium because the product warranted it, because whatever I had done in that hollow, the result was something the market valued. I walked back to Harlan's Hollow with coins in my pocket for the first time since I had arrived. I sat on the stone footings outside the cave mouth and held the coins in my palm and looked at the corridor and the bluff in the mouth of the cave, and I thought about Ezra writing in his first ledger, "I believe the questions are worth $9 at minimum." He had understood exactly. He had just run out of time before he could prove it. Word spread through Mercy, crossing the way news moves in small places, not through announcement, but through conversation. One person telling another the story, changing slightly with each telling, but its essential core remaining stable. The Vance girl in the hollow had something that kept vegetables fresh past their season, and Mabel Cobb was paying good money for them, which meant they were real and not a trick. Asa Whitmore came first. He was a widower with 3 children in a farm that ran close enough to the edge each year that a bad season didn't just mean hardship. It meant the particular arithmetic of a man calculating whether he can make it to spring without losing something permanent. He came to my yard with his hat in his hands in the particular careful dignity of a man asking for something he's not certain he deserves to ask for. "I've got more turnips than I can use," he said. "Lost half my root vegetables last year to rot. If you could store some through the winter." "Bring them," I said. He looked at the corridor, at the bluff, at the cave mouth visible beyond the corridor's far door. The suspicion in his face was transparent, but behind the suspicion was something more urgent. "How much?" "A share of what survives. You keep the rest." He came back Wednesday with a wagon half full of turnips. 2 weeks later, a neighbor of his came with a crate of potatoes. Then a woman from the far end of the valley with dried beans she was worried about for different reasons. By November, I had the alcove packed and 6 families' winter food in storage, and a simple ledger of my own, not 14 volumes spanning 31 years, but a start recording whose goods were where and what the agreement was for each. The worthless inheritance was becoming something else. Cormac's cough had been getting worse since summer. He had mentioned the quarry dust years before in the offhand way men mention things. They have already decided to accept the quarry, where he had worked for 20 years before his eyesight began to go the stone dust that had gone into his lungs with every breath he'd taken in that place. It had been working on him for a long time. The winter cold accelerated it. Some days he came up the hollow and worked beside me, his hands steady on the tools, his eyes still reading wood and stone with a precision that had nothing to do with youth and everything to do with years. Other days he sat on the stone footings and watched me work and said what needed saying when I asked and said nothing when I didn't. On those days, I could see the effort it cost him simply to sit still and breathe the shallow, careful respiration of a man whose lungs had been narrowed by something he could not argue with. One afternoon in late October, sitting on the footings while I worked on widening the corridor's storage section, he said, "My wife's name was Lena." I kept working. I had learned that the way to hear the things Cormac needed to say was to do nothing that might make him think he was being listened to with too much attention. "She made the best apple butter in the valley. People came from 2 hollows over for it in August." A pause. "She laughed at my jokes even when they weren't funny, which they often weren't." "When did she die?" 61 fever in the winter of 78. He was quiet for a moment. The sound of my work, the auger going into a board slow and steady, filled the space between his words. "After she went, I considered going to the quarry pit and not coming out of it. I stopped working." "What stopped you?" I said. He looked at his hands, the large lime-whitened hands folded in his lap, the knuckles enlarged from decades of work, the skin thin and marked with the small scars of a life spent in contact with hard things. "I realized that dying was easy," he said. "I'd watched enough men do it to know it doesn't take any particular skill. Living was the hard thing, the one that required something from you every single morning." He looked up, not at me, at the bluff above the cave mouth. I'd spent my whole life doing hard things. Seemed like a waste to stop at that point. He said it without a drama, without the self-conscious weight of a man delivering a lesson. He said it the way he said everything, as a plain fact that he had arrived at through observation and that he was simply making available in case it was useful. I thought about it for a long time. Douglas Pruitt came on a cold afternoon in November. I knew who he was before he gave his name. Cormac had described him with the economy of someone describing a weather system, not evil exactly, but organized in a particular direction and powerful enough to do damage to anything that stood in its path. He came on a gray horse wearing a coat that cost more than everything I owned combined, and he did not dismount when he reached the edge of my yard. He was perhaps 50, a heavy man with a broad face and steady pale eyes that moved over the corridor and the bluff and the cave mouth, the way a man's eyes move over property he is in the process of assessing. He had the manner of someone who was accustomed to being the largest presence in any conversation he entered. "Miss Vance," he said, not a greeting, a confirmation, the way you confirm an address before delivering something. "Mr. Pruitt?" He looked at the corridor for a moment, at the cave mouth beyond it. Then he looked at me. "I've been hearing things," he said. "What kind of things?" "That you've got some kind of storage system. Vegetables fresh past their season. That you're burning half the wood, the rest of the valley is burning and staying just as warm." He paused. "That your grandfather wasn't as confused as everyone thought." "My grandfather understood exactly what he was doing," I said. "People thought he was confused because they weren't paying attention." Pruitt's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted slightly, a small recalibration, the way a man adjusts his approach when the first approach produces an unexpected response. "I've made offers on this land before," he said, "to your grandfather. The standing offer was $22. He looked at me directly. "I'll make it 25. That's more than anyone else in this county would give you for 12 acres of limestone and a hole in a cliff." The hollow was very quiet. Somewhere up on the ridge, a wind moved through the bare upper branches, a dry rattling sound. The cave breathed. I could feel it from where I stood, that slight movement of air out of the dark mouth of the rock, 53 degrees of mountain patience flowing through the door we had made for it. I looked at Douglas Pruitt on his gray horse, and I understood something. It arrived not as a conclusion, but as a recognition, the same feeling I had gotten in the lawyer's office when the word breathes had fired something in my chest. Pruitt had been trying to buy this land for years. He had gone from $12 to $22 to $25. He would go higher. A man does not raise his price on land that has no value. He raises his price on land that has value he is afraid someone else will recognize. But what I saw now was something Ezra had seen and written down in his 13th ledger. A man who wants something too urgently has already seen the thing the seller hasn't recognized yet. And the thing Pruitt was afraid of wasn't the cave or the corridor or the thermal storage. It wasn't the vegetables or the wood savings or anything Ezra had designed and I had built. It was the proof. If what I was doing in this hollow worked, and it was working demonstrably, measurably, with 6 families worth of winter food and storage, and a corridor holding 53 degrees of mountain air in the worst cold November had offered so far, then the entire edifice of Pruitt's power in this valley rested on softer ground. His power was the power of people who needed credit to survive a hard winter. People who couldn't make their food last, who burned through their wood too fast, who came to him in February with nothing left to bargain with. If a 16-year-old girl with $1.32 in a dead man's ledgers could change the terms of winter survival in these hollows, then the people who needed Pruitt's credit in February might need it a little less. He was not buying land. He was buying silence. "No," I said. The word fell into the quiet of the hollow without decoration. Pruitt looked at me for a moment, the pale eyes steady. "It's going to be a hard winter, Miss Vance," he said. "Harder than last year. When that corridor of yours fails and you're burning greenwood in the dark at 20 below, you'll think differently about $25. I looked at him, at the gray horse, at the expensive coat, at the pale eyes that had looked at Ezra Vance the same way for 20 years and never once looked in the right direction. "My grandfather bought this land for $9, I said. The auctioneer laughed at him. Every person in Mercy Crossing agreed he was wasting his money on something worthless. I paused. He spent 31 years proving them wrong. I've spent 1 year finishing what he started. I looked at the cave mouth, at the corridor, at the bluff rising above it all. I will not sell this land to a man who has never once looked at it correctly. Pruitt's expression did not change. He looked at me for a moment longer, then turned his horse and rode back up the track without another word. Cormac had been sitting on the stone footings through all of this, still and quiet. He waited until the sound of hoofbeats had faded up the hollow before he spoke. "He'll come back," he said. "I know. Men like that always do. They have time and they're accustomed to waiting people out." "Then they can wait," I said. "I'm not going anywhere." Cormac looked at me for a long moment with his single dark eye. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a pipe. He rarely lit anymore, his lungs didn't allow it, and simply held it in his hands, turning it over. "Ezra said the same thing," he said. "Almost exactly those words." A pause. "He meant it too, until the end." He put the pipe away and stood slowly with effort, his body making its objections known in the quiet of the hollow. He looked at the corridor, at the boards I had been working on, at the expanding storage section inside the cave mouth. "Your grandfather would have liked you," he said. "He would have liked you quite a lot." He began the walk back down the hollow to his cabin, moving with the careful steadiness of a man who has learned to respect his own limits without surrendering to them. I watched him until the hemlock and rhododendron closed around him, and he was gone. The warning came on the last evening of December 1898. I was banking the stove for the night, building the coals down to a slow, sustainable burn that would hold through the dark hours when I heard boots on the shale outside. The man who came through the door was not anyone I had seen before. He was perhaps 50, lean in the way men get lean, who spend their lives outdoors in all weather. His face burned and weathered to a texture like old leather. His beard had ice in it. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had seen something he was still in the process of processing. "You're the Vance girl," he said, "the one with the cave system." "I am, Nora Vance. Silas Cross. I run trap lines from here to the Virginia line." He stepped inside and I could see that he was cold in the deep way. Not the ordinary cold of a winter evening, but the bone cold of a man who had been moving hard through serious cold for a long distance. "I need you to listen to what I'm about to say." "I'm listening." He looked around the cabin at the quarter door, standing slightly open, at the thermometer on the wall reading 44 degrees in the cabin, at the general evidence of a system that was doing what it was supposed to do. "I've been running trap lines in these mountains for 30 years, he said. "I know what weather feels like when it's coming. I know the signs." He stopped and looked at me directly. "What's coming is not ordinary winter cold. The pressure has been dropping for 4 days in a way I have never seen. The sky to the north has a color I have only seen once before in the winter of 72, and in 72, 12 people in this county did not make it to spring." The fire in the stove ticked. "How long?" I said. "A week, maybe less." He looked at the corridor door. "Your system does it hold in real cold, not November cold. February cold." "I don't know yet. It held last winter." "Last winter was not what's coming." He held my gaze. "I've got miles left tonight, people to warn. But I wanted you to know, whatever you're doing here, whatever your grandfather built, you'd better make sure it's finished and tight before the end of this week." He left before I could offer him food or a place to sit. He had more hollows to cover, more doors to knock, on more people to warn before the dark settled in completely. I stood in the doorway after he was gone and looked at the sky to the north. Silas Cross was right about the color. I had not seen it before, but something in the way it sat against the ridgeline, a blue that was not ordinary winter blue, but something deeper, something with weight in it, told me that the man who had been reading this sky for 30 years was not wrong. I looked at the corridor. At the section of the outer wall that Cormac and I had planned to finish in the spring, the part connecting the cave door to the proper exterior entrance, the part that was still partially open to the elements, the part we had been putting off because winter had seemed to be cooperating and spring was only a few months away. Spring was too far. I went inside and got the hammer. I worked through the night. There was no other choice, and having no choice, as I had learned in the first weeks of living in Harlan's Hollow, simplifies things considerably. You do not waste energy on deliberation. You simply begin. The section of corridor that remained unfinished was at the cave end, the outer passage connecting the cave mouth door to the proper exterior entrance, The part Cormac and I had framed in the early weeks and then left partially open while we concentrated on sealing the cabin end section that mattered most for immediate survival. It was perhaps 8 feet of framed wall on the north-facing side, the boards nailed across the frame, but the gaps between them still open to the elements. The joints unsealed the roof section above. It covered only with the first layer of boards and not the second. 8 feet. In any other circumstance, 2 days of work. I had until the end of the week. I lit the lantern and carried it to the cave mouth and set it on the stone footings and looked at what needed to be done. Then I began. The boards went on first. I had a small remaining stock from the last of the porch lumber, enough to cover the gaps if I was careful about placement and didn't waste any to bad cuts. I worked by lantern light, the flames steady in the still air of the hollow, the cold coming down around me, in the particular way it comes when a serious front is building somewhere to the north, and the air in front of it has already changed its character. My breath made clouds that the lantern light caught briefly and dissolved. I was nailing the third board into place when I heard footsteps on the shale. Cormac came out of the dark with his leather satchel over one shoulder and his lantern in his other hand, moving carefully over the frozen ground. He did not explain his presence. He set his lantern beside mine on the footings, opened his satchel, and took out his trowel. "The mortar needs to be mixed warmer tonight," he said. "Lime won't cure right if it freezes before it sets. We'll need to keep it close to the stove between coats." He had heard about the weather. He had come anyway in the dark a mile up the hollow with his ruined lungs and his 70-year-old joints and his one good eye, because there was work that needed doing, and he was not yet finished with the work. I didn't say anything. There was nothing adequate to say. We simply worked. Through the night and into the gray light of the next morning and through most of that day. Cormac mixed the mortar in small batches, keeping it covered with a wet cloth near the stove's warmth. When he wasn't using it, bringing it out to the wall, applying it in the thin, even coats we had learned were the only reliable method. I nailed boards, cut the last roof boards to fit, drove the pine pitch and hemlock bark sealer into the seam between the old roof section and the new, with a flat stick, working it in before it cooled and stiffened. Cormac's cough came in waves. He would work through 3 or 4 minutes of steady progress, then stop with his hand braced against the quarter wall, the cough taking him completely for a time, his whole body organized around it. When it passed, he straightened up and went back to the trowel. He never mentioned it. I never mentioned it. There was work, and the work was what mattered, and mentioning the cough would only have made the time it took to pass feel longer for both of us. By the following afternoon, it was done. I stood at the cave end of the corridor and looked down its full length, 28 feet, now sealed and framed, the cave door at one end and the cabin door at the other, the baffle vent in the middle adjusted to its working position. I could feel the mountain's breath at my back flowing through the cave door, moving down the corridor toward the cabin, the way it always moved, patient and indifferent and absolutely reliable. Ezra Vance had designed this in a ledger book, lying on his stomach on the floor of his cabin, with a carpenter's pencil, working out dimensions and airflows and materials with the same methodical care he brought to recording temperatures in November. He had laid the stone footings in 1892. He had never seen a corridor built on them. It was built now. 27 years after the footings went in, and 2 years after the man who designed it had died waiting for the spring, he didn't get the system was complete, exactly as he had drawn it, exactly as he had planned. I put my hand flat against the corridor wall and held it there for a moment. Then I went inside to sleep. The storm arrived the following afternoon. The wind came first. It came from the north, the way serious weather comes in the Allegheny Highlands. Not gradually, not with the courtesy of warning beyond the color of the sky and the way the birds had gone silent 2 days before, but suddenly and at full strength, as though it had been saving itself. It hit the hollow with a sound like the whole world tightening, the trees above the bluff, thrashing, and the surface of the creek hammered flat, and the dead winter grass in the yard flattening to the south in a single unified gesture of submission. The temperature began dropping within an hour. It had been 22 degrees when the wind came. By dark, it was below zero. By midnight, the outdoor thermometer, which I checked through the gap in the shutter before I built the stove fire down for sleeping, read 14 below. By morning, I couldn't read it anymore. The thermometer itself had frozen. The fluid in the tube contracted past the instrument's range, leaving nothing visible to measure. I stood at the shutter gap and looked out at a world that had gone entirely still beneath the weight of the cold, the creek frozen bank to bank. Now the ice on the rock face of the bluff glazed and blue in the early light, and understood that Silas Cross had been right about every word. This was not ordinary winter cold. Inside the cabin connected through the open corridor door to the mountain's steady breath, the temperature held at 44 degrees. I had a fire going small, just enough to take the worst edge off the air and heat the cooking water, and between the stove and the cave, the cabin maintained the particular quality of cold that is uncomfortable but livable. The kind of cold that makes you keep your coat on indoors and sleep under everything you own. Not the kind that kills you. Outside the valley was a different story. I learned the details in pieces over the following days from the people who began appearing at the edge of my yard. Asa Whitmore came on the fourth day. He came to check on his turnips, which were fine, which were exactly as he'd left them, which was the point, but also to talk the way isolated people talk when something is happening, and talking is the only way to make sense of it. The creek between his farm and his nearest neighbor had frozen solid enough to walk on, which it had never done in the 20 years he'd worked that land. He'd lost 2 pigs to the cold despite bringing them into the barn. His woodpile, which he'd thought was adequate, was going at twice the rate he'd planned for. The story was the same up and down the valley. Families that had stacked what seemed like sufficient firewood were discovering that sufficient was a calculation made for ordinary winters, and this was not an ordinary winter. Families that had relatives in Union or Lewisburg considered leaving, and some did, and the ones who stayed burned green wood when the dry ran out wood that smoked and sputtered and gave off half the heat it promised, while filling the house with the kind of air that was slow to leave. The Clover Ridge Relief House in Union, where Mrs. Ida Holt had presided over 30-some girls for 22 years, with institutional authority and institutional confidence, had ice forming on the inside of its dormitory windows. I knew this because one of Asa Whitmore's children had a cousin who attended the affiliated church school, and news moved through those connections the way news always moves in rural places, sideways, and informal and entirely reliable in its essentials. On the 9th day, Mabel Cobb came. She arrived without Percy, who she said was too proud. She herself came with no preamble and no softening of approach. She knocked once, opened the door before I answered, stepped inside and looked around at the corridor door standing open, at the thermometer on the wall reading 44 degrees, at the evidence of a system that was doing in the worst cold, in living memory, exactly what it had been designed to do. My wood supplier sold out on day 6, she said. Percy is burning the packing crates from the back storeroom. How long will that last? 4 days if he's careful. I looked at her, the woman who had bought my potatoes for 2 cents each in September, who had written the number in her ledger and said nothing about caves or hollows or the old Vance man who everyone had agreed was not right in the head. How many people in Mercy Crossing are in the same position? I said. She calculated. I could see her doing it, the same mental arithmetic I had seen her run over the potato prices, quick and precise. A third, maybe more. The ones who planned ahead are managing. The ones who didn't, she stopped. Send them here, I said. She looked at me. There's not room. Send them anyway. She left, and within 2 days the first family appeared. Then another. They came carefully at first, not sure of their welcome, not sure of the place, the hollow, the strange corridor built against a limestone bluff by a dead man and his orphaned granddaughter. They stood in the yard and looked at the steam rising from the cave mouth, and the corridor standing solid in temperatures that were making everything else in the valley flex and crack and fail. And something moved behind their eyes, not belief, not yet, but the beginning of it. I opened the door to every one of them. The corridor filled first. People sleeping on the boards, wrapped in everything they had brought, children tucked against parents. The body heat of gathered people yielding its small contribution to the mountain's steady breath. Then the cabin filled. Then the storage alcove where the potatoes and turnips and onions were still perfectly preserved in the 53-degree air, and where families could at least sit against the cave wall and feel the stone's indifference to the cold raging outside. I kept a pot of soup going on the stove, stretching the last of the stored vegetables to feed as many mouths as I could. Turnip and dried bean, mostly with what little salt I had left, in the iron taste of the spring water. It was not good soup. It was sustaining soup, which was sufficient. Cormac had been staying with me since the fifth day when the walk between our cabins became more than his lungs would allow. He sat in the chair near the stove and watched the people come in and find their places on the floor and settle into the particular quiet of exhausted people who have arrived somewhere marginally safer than where they were. He watched without expression, his large hands folded in his lap, his good eye moving slowly over the faces in the room. One evening in a gap between arrivals, he looked at me across the crowded room and said quietly, "Most of them thought Ezra was a fool. I know. They don't deserve this." I was stirring the soup. I didn't look up. Maybe not, but cold doesn't care who was kind and who wasn't. And I decided a long time ago that I wasn't going to be colder than the weather. He was quiet for a moment. "Ezra would have done the same thing," he said. "Exactly the same." On the 15th day, Douglas Pruitt came. I recognized the figure at the yard's edge even before I could see his face clearly, the broad shoulders, the heavy-set frame. But the gray horse was not with him. He was on foot. 6 men followed behind him, moving the way men move when they have been cold for a long time and have gone past the point of dignity, about it hunched lips the color of bruised plum, eyes fixed on the cabin door, with the singular focus of people who have reduced their immediate existence to a single objective. I stood in the doorway and watched Pruitt come across the yard. He did not call out. He did not wave. He simply walked toward me with the careful, deliberate steps of a man who has made a decision he has not entirely made peace with. He stopped at the edge of the porch where the old porch boards had been before I pulled them to build the corridor, and he looked at me. The pale eyes were the same, but the certainty behind them was different. The certainty was still there, but it had been rearranged. The cold had done something to the architecture of his confidence, had found the gaps in it, the way wind finds gaps in a poorly sealed wall. "My warehouse roof collapsed under the ice," he said, "3 days ago. My men have been in the woodyard building, and it's not holding." I looked at the 6 men behind him. Workers, men who cut wood and hauled it and did the hard physical labor that Pruitt's business required. They had not asked to be here. They had simply followed their employer because he was going somewhere warmer and they were cold enough to follow anyone going somewhere warmer. "The men can come in," I said. Pruitt looked at me. "They go first," I said. "There's room along the corridor wall, near the middle where the baffle runs warmest." He stood for a moment, then he stepped aside and gestured to the men behind him. They filed past him without ceremony, moving into the corridor, with the instinctive relief of people stepping out of a hard wind, finding spaces against the wall, sinking down into the collective warmth of the bodies already there. Pruitt was the last one through the door. I was standing just inside the cabin end of the corridor when he entered, and I let him get a few steps in before I spoke. "Look at the thermometer," I said. He looked. 44 degrees on the cabin thermometer visible through the open door. 53 on the corridor wall directly at eye level. "Your grandfather," he began, "understood exactly what he was doing," I said. "You've been trying to buy this land for years. You offered my grandfather $22 for something you knew was worth more than that." I paused. "I want to know what you knew." The corridor was not quiet. The sounds of 15 people breathing and shifting and the distant tick of the stove filled the space. But in the particular zone around Pruitt and me, there was the kind of stillness that descends when people who are ostensibly doing other things are actually paying close attention. Pruitt looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at the corridor walls, at the cave door at the far end, at the thermometer, at the whole system standing solid in temperatures that had broken his roof and emptied his wood supply. "There's a rail spur coming through this valley," he said finally. "The Baltimore and Ohio. Survey was done 2 years ago. The right-of-way runs directly through the lower end of this hollow." A pause. "Whoever controls the land controls the access point for the whole eastern section of Monroe County." I let the silence hold for a moment. "So it was never about the cave," I said. "I didn't know about the cave. Not what it could do." He looked at the thermometer again. "I knew about the right-of-way. And my grandfather. Your grandfather refused every offer I made, wouldn't tell me why. Just said the land wasn't for sale to a man who wanted it too fast." Something moved through his face. I thought he was being difficult. "He was being correct," I said. Another silence. Behind Pruitt, his 6 workers had settled against the corridor wall, and several of them were already closing their eyes, the particular surrender of the exhausted to warmth after cold. The right-of-way survey, I said. Is it recorded at the county clerk's office? And with the railroad's land office in Grafton? Then it's public record, which means I can read it myself. Pruitt looked at me. The pale eyes were doing something I had not seen them do before, recalculating, not from a position of advantage, but from a position of equivalence. Perhaps from a position slightly below equivalence. What do you want, Miss Vance? I want to be left alone to do my work, I said. I want to not hear from your representatives about purchasing this property. I want my grandfather's name to be spoken in this valley the way people speak the name of a man who was right about something important. He was quiet for a long time. And if the railroad comes, he said, what then? Then we'll negotiate from a position of mutual information, I said, which is a different conversation than the one you've been trying to have for 6 years. Pruitt looked at me, this 16-year-old girl in a dress worn thin at the elbows, standing in a corridor she had built herself from salvaged porch lumber and a dead man's blueprints, while the temperature outside killed the weakest things that hadn't found shelter. He nodded once, slowly. There's room against the east wall of the corridor, I said. Near the stove end. You'll be warmer there. He moved to the wall without another word. I watched him settle in beside his workers. Douglas Pruitt, who owned the woodyard and held notes on half the farms in the valley, sitting on the same plank floor as the families who owed him money, breathing the same mountain air, equally dependent on the system that a crazy old schoolteacher had designed and his orphaned granddaughter had built. Cormac had watched all of this from his chair. When I came back through the cabin door, he caught my eye and raised one white creased hand in a gesture too small to call a wave, but too deliberate to be accidental. Acknowledgement, respect, the particular communication of a man who has seen something done correctly and wants the person who did it to know he noticed. I went back to the soup and stirred it and said nothing because there was nothing that needed to be said. On the 18th night, the wind shifted. It had been coming from the north the entire time, brutal, consistent, knowable. A wind from a fixed direction is a wind you can account for and plan for seal against. When it shifted, moving south and then southwest, swirling down into the hollow, from an angle the corridor had not been designed to face directly, it found something. I was asleep on the floor. I had given the iron bedstead to an elderly woman named Mrs. Prentice, who had come from the far end of the valley with her grandson and a single blanket when I heard it. A sound I knew from the first winter. A focused, sustained whistling, high and thin, from the direction of the outer quarter section. I was moving before I was fully awake. The corridor was dark, the lanterns burned low, to conserve oil sow, casting just enough light to navigate by. People were sleeping along both walls, wrapped shapes in the dimness. I moved through them carefully, stepping over legs and around bundles, making my way to the cave end. The seam was in the north wall of the outer section, the part we had built in one night. The weakest part of the entire system, the place where haste and exhaustion and the limits of what two people could accomplish in the dark had left something less than perfect. The mortar had held through 17 days of north wind. The southwest wind found a different angle, a different stress point in the seam there had opened. Not catastrophically, an inch at most, perhaps less, but an inch was enough. The cold outside was somewhere around 20 below, and even a small gap at that temperature was a committed adversary. I went back for the hammer and the bag of leftover linen strips and the small tin of mortar mix that Cormac kept prepared, and I came back to the seam and crouched in the dark corridor, people sleeping 3 feet away on either side, and began working. I heard movement behind me. Cormac was there, lowering himself to the floor with the effort it always cost him, now his bad knee making its opinion known without apology. He did not ask what I needed. He reached into the mortar tin, felt the consistency in the dark, and added a small amount of water from the tin cup he was carrying, mixed it with one finger, and held the tin out to me. In the dark and the cold, with the wind hitting the outside wall hard enough to vibrate the boards under my hands, we sealed the seam. Linen first packed in tight, then mortar thin and even applied by feel more than sight. Coat, weight, coat again. I could not see whether it was right. I could only work by the standard Cormac had taught me, by the way the trowel felt moving through the mixture, by the resistance, when the mortar began to adhere, by the sound of the wind against the outside of the wall, and whether the pitch of it changed when we covered a section. When we finished, and the whistling had stopped, and the wind had nothing to say through that wall anymore, I looked at the thermometer mounted on the corridor's midpoint. 41 degrees. The system had held. The gap had been open for perhaps 20 minutes, and the temperature had dropped 3 degrees, and then we had closed it, and the mountain's breath had done what it always did, filled the space, steadied the air, kept the temperature from going where it would have gone if the corridor had not been there. I sat on the corridor floor with the hammer in my lap and my back against the wall and felt the cold of the boards through my clothing and listened to the breathing of the people sleeping around me. 41 degrees. The survival math of it was straightforward. A room at 41 degrees shared by 15 people with a small fire in the adjoining stove was survivable in a way that a room at 20 below was not. The difference was a 28-foot corridor built of old porch lumber and lime mortar, and the 31 years of a school teacher who never stopped asking why. Cormac sat beside me against the wall. After a while, he said, "That seam will need a third coat when the temperature comes up enough to cure properly." "I know, but it'll hold tonight." "Yes." He nodded. We sat together in the dark while the mountain breathed around us and the wind outside argued with the walls and found nothing to argue through. On the 23rd day, the Bickham family came. There were 4 of them, Gerald Bickham, his wife, and their 2 grown sons. They arrived at the yard's edge in the late afternoon, Gerald in front with his hat pulled down against the wind, his wife behind him, the sons carrying a small bundle of their remaining possessions, and the look of young men who have inherited their father's pride but not yet his pride's full weight. Gerald Bickham was a solid, weathered man in his 60s who had farmed the same land for 40 years and who had, in the course of those 40 years, developed opinions about most things that were not easily revised. He stood at the edge of my yard and looked at the corridor and the bluff and the cave mouth with the same expression of stubborn assessment he had probably brought to everything he had ever looked at. He did not recognize me at first. It had been 5 years, and 5 years in a life like mine changes a person more than 5 years in a life like his. I recognized him. "Mr. Bickham," I said. He looked at me more carefully. His wife looked at me. Something moved through her face, a slow, uncomfortable recognition assembling itself from features that had been younger and smaller the last time she had seen them. "You're the girl," Mrs. Bickham said. Her voice was not unkind. It was simply the voice of a woman confronting something she had not prepared to confront. "The one we had before." "The one you sent away," I said, "for reading by lantern light after dark." Gerald Bickham looked at me steadily. He was not a man who flinched. I had known that about him even as a child, but he looked at me now with the particular expression of a man who is aware that a debt exists and who is standing in front of the person he owes it to. "We didn't think," he began. "No, I said. "You didn't." A silence. The cold pressed down on all of us. Behind me through the corridor door, the mountain's breath moved as it always moves, steady and patient, 52 degrees of accumulated mountain time flowing through a structure built on a dead man's footings. "Come inside," I said. "There's room." There wasn't room. Not really. The cabin and corridor were already packed with people sleeping in shifts, sharing floor space with the careful, unconscious diplomacy of people who have more important things to worry about than personal space. But I made room the way you make room when making room is what you have to offer. I found them a section of corridor wall to sleep against, and Mrs. Bickham pressed my hand when I showed her where, and she didn't say anything, and I didn't require her to. Gerald Bickham sat against the wall with his 2 sons and looked at what was around him, at the corridor, at the thermometer, at the people who had come to this hollow, because there was nowhere else the cold couldn't reach. And he looked at it for a long time. In his face, I could see something working. Not regret exactly, or not only regret, something more complicated. The expression of a man who is revising a long-held view of something and finding the revision both necessary and late. He never said anything about the lantern light. He never mentioned the reason he had sent me back to the relief house. But in the days that followed, he carried water from the spring without being asked, and he helped me bank the stove each night so the fire would hold until morning. And on the 26th day, when a section of the outer corridor roof developed a small leak, where the ice above it had shifted and pressed on an unsealed joint, Gerald Bickham was the one who climbed up and fixed it, working in the cold with the competence of a man who has spent 40 years maintaining things. He did not ask me to call it even. He just fixed the roof and came back inside. On the 27th day, Mrs. Ida Holt came. I did not know it was her at first. She appeared at the yard's edge in the late morning, bundled so completely in woolen blanket that her shape was difficult to determine, moving with the careful, deliberate steps of someone who is cold in the deep way and has been cold for a long time. Two small girls came with her girls. I didn't know. Children from the Clover Ridge Relief House, 8 or 9 years old, moving close together the way children move when they are uncertain of their welcome. I opened the corridor door. The woman unwrapped enough of her face for me to see her. She was older than I remembered. The 4 years since the reading of the will had done something to her face beyond the ordinary passage of time, a thinning, a loosening, as though the absolute certainty she had always worn had required some structural support that was no longer entirely available to her. The steel gray hair was hidden under a wool cap. The eyes were the same, but they did not look certain. "Miss Vance." Her voice was smaller than I remembered. Not weak exactly, smaller. "Mrs. Holt." She looked past me into the corridor at the people settled along its walls, at the thermometer at the cave door standing open at the far end, the mountain's breath moving through it as it always moved. She looked at all of it for a long moment. "It works," she said. The words came out carrying the weight of something she had not wanted to admit and had run out of the resources to withhold. "It actually works." "Yes," she looked at me. There was something in her face that I had never seen there before, not in 4 years of living under her authority, not in the morning she had read the will, with its box of wind and its house built against a grave. What I saw now was the expression of a woman who has been wrong about something important and who has finally stopped having the energy to pretend otherwise. "Your grandfather wrote to me," she said. The corridor went very quiet, or perhaps it had been quiet and I only noticed it now. The people against the walls, the Bickhams, the Whitmore children, Mrs. Prentice and her grandson Pruitt's workers, half a dozen others who had come in the last 2 weeks were awake, and still the way people are, still when they understand that something is happening that they should not interrupt. "I know," I said, "in 1891, after your mother passed." She swallowed. "He sent $10, train fare and wagon fare. He wanted you brought to him." "I know. I made a decision." She stopped. She was looking at me steadily, and it was clearly costing her. "I thought the place was unsuitable for a child. I thought he was another stop. I told myself I was protecting you from an old man in a hollow that was too far from proper society, too far from schools and churches, and the things a girl needed to have a chance in life." She reached into the layers of her coat. Her hand was shaking from the cold, partly but not only from the cold. She drew out an envelope. It was yellowed. The paper had gone soft with age, handled, and then put away, and then perhaps taken out again, and handled again over the years, the envelope developing the particular texture of something that has been lived with. The address was written in the small, cramped, precise handwriting I would have known anywhere. "Miss Nora Vance, care of the Clover Ridge Relief House, Union, West Virginia." Ezra Vance's hand. My grandfather's handwriting on a letter written in 1891, the year my mother died, the year he sent for me. The year Mrs. Ida Holt had decided I didn't need to receive it. "I kept it," she said, "and I kept the money. I put it in the house account." She held the envelope out. "I am not a person who apologizes easily, but I was wrong. I was wrong about him, and I was wrong about this place, and I was wrong to keep this from you." A pause. "And I was wrong about you." The cabin was absolutely silent. I looked at the envelope in her outstretched hand, at my name on it in Ezra's handwriting, at the stamp in the corner that had been canceled in the fall of 1891. This letter had traveled from Harlan's Hollow to the postal office in Union and had been received at the Clover Ridge Relief House and had sat in Mrs. Ida Holt's desk for 4 years, while I spent those years being told my questions were impertinence and my reading was vanity. Ezra Vance had sent for me. He had sent money. He had written a letter to his granddaughter in his small, precise handwriting, and the letter had gotten to exactly where it was supposed to go, and the person who received it had decided for reasons that probably seemed sound to her at the time that I didn't need to know about it. 4 years, 4 winters at the relief house, and my grandfather dying in 1893 alone, waiting for the spring that didn't come. I took the envelope from her hand. I did not open it. I already knew what it said. I had read the 14th ledger. I had read the letter to the child who still asks why. I knew what Ezra Vance had wanted me to know, and I knew it because he had found his hiding place and read everything he had left me, everything except this which had never reached me through the channel it was supposed to travel. I held the envelope for a moment and looked at it. Then I looked at Mrs. Ida Holt. "I forgive you," I said. She blinked. Something moved through her face. "Not because you chose well," I said. "You didn't choose well. You chose what was convenient for you and called it protection, and the difference between those two things matters, and I think you know that it does." I paused. "But I will not let your choice define the shape of my life any further than it already has. I have work to do. I have been doing it. And carrying anger at you while I do it is a weight I can't afford." She stood in the corridor doorway with the cold at her back and the mountain's breath at her front, and tears running down her face that she did not wipe away. "The girls," she said, "they need warmth." "Then bring them in," I said. "There's room." I stepped aside. There was not really room. The corridor was packed. The cabin was full. Every flat surface had become someone's sleeping place. But I stepped aside and she brought the two small girls through the door, and I found them a section of wall near the pail vent where the air was warmest, and I got them each a cup of hot water from the stove and a portion of the turnip soup that was all I had left to offer. Cormac was watching from his chair. He caught my eye across the room, across the heads of people who had laughed at Ezra Vance and called his granddaughter foolish, and were now sleeping on her floor and eating her soup and breathing the mountain's air through the corridor he had designed and she had built. He held my gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once, the particular nod of a man who has seen something completed. On the 31st day, the cold broke. It did not break graciously. The temperature rose by degrees over 2 days, the wind shifted to the south and then fell away entirely, and the morning of the third day arrived with a quality of light in the hollow that was different from any morning I had seen in the previous month, a light that had warmth in its intention. Even if not yet in its temperature, a light that said the worst of it was done. The creek began to move again at its center, the ice pulling back from a thin channel of running water that widened over the following days. The birds came back to the ridge. The hemlock above the bluff exhaled something that was almost fragrance, the resin warming enough to be perceptible in the air, and I stood outside the cabin and breathed it and felt the quality of it in my lungs. People left, one by one then in small groups, gathering their things and making their way back to the farms and houses they had left to come here. Some thanked me. Some couldn't look at me. The Bickham's older son pressed a coin into my hand as he passed through the corridor and walked away quickly without speaking. Gerald Bickham himself paused at the cave end of the corridor and stood looking at the lintel stone for a moment, the shaped limestone Ezra had placed in 1892, the stone that had waited 7 years for the door hung beneath it. He put his hand on the stone briefly and then walked away down the hollow without turning back. Pruitt's workers left on the morning of the thaw, nodding to me as they filed through the corridormen whose names I had learned during those weeks. Ferris, who had a daughter the age of the Whitmore children. Dawson, who had worked in the woodyard for 11 years and whose hands showed it. Pruitt himself was the last of them to go. He stopped at the cave end of the corridor and stood looking at the lintel stone the way Gerald Bickham had. Then he looked at the corridor itself, the walls, the sealed joints, the baffle vent, the whole system that had stood between 20 below and the people sleeping inside it. He turned to me. "The railroad survey," he said. "When you read it, you'll find that the right-of-way runs along the base of this bluff. Your cave is listed as a geological feature of note." He paused. The surveyor mentioned the temperature anomaly. He noted it without understanding it. "He didn't have the journals," I said. "No." Pruitt looked at me. "Miss Vance, I will not make further offers on this property. And when the railroad comes to negotiate, I will tell them, you are the person to speak with." I looked at him for a moment. "Why?" I said. "Because the man who wants to buy too fast has already seen something the seller hasn't recognized yet." He held my gaze. I recognized it too late. But I recognized it. He walked out of the corridor and down the hollow without looking back. Mabel Cobb came on the last day with Percy, who was a quiet man who expressed himself through actions rather than words. He looked at the corridor, at the cave, at the system in general. Then he went back to his wagon and came back with a bolt of oilcloth and a paper bag of cornmeal and a small crock of lard, which he set inside the cabin door without comment. Mabel looked at me. "Whatever your grandfather was," she said, "he was right." "Yes," I said, "he was." Professor Arthur Keene came in April from the academy in Lewisburg. He was a thin man with spectacles, in the manner of someone who has spent a long time trying to explain things to people who weren't listening and who has become philosophical about this without becoming resigned to it. He had heard about the Vance Girls Cave system from a colleague whose cousin lived in Mercy Crossing, and he had traveled 30 miles on spring roads that were still half mud to see if the account he'd received bore any relationship to physical reality. I showed him everything: the corridor, the baffle vent, the storage alcove, the thermometer, records. I had been keeping my own ledger, now a 15th volume, to add to Ezra's 14 recording temperatures every morning and evening, the way Ezra had taught me to record them. I let him read the relevant sections of the original 14 journals, the observation records, the airflow maps, the construction plans. He spent 4 days measuring and asking questions. Some of the questions I could answer, some I could not in the formal language he used, though I understood the underlying principle he was asking about. On the fourth evening, he sat on the stone footings outside the cave mouth and looked at the corridor and the bluff above it with the expression of a man who is revising his understanding of something significant. "Your grandfather," he said, "understood thermal mass and convective airflow better than most trained engineers I have met. The principle he identified is real and documented in European building literature, but no one in this region has demonstrated it at a practical scale." He paused. "And no one anywhere has demonstrated it under the conditions of last February." "He had 31 years of evidence," I said. "He just didn't have the hands to build it. And you had the hands. And Cormac Briggs had both the hands and the knowledge to teach me. The three of us together made one complete engineer." Keene smiled. "I'd like to write a paper, a monograph distributed to other academies and to the engineering societies in Philadelphia and Baltimore, crediting your grandfather as the originator of the principle and you as the builder who proved it under real-world conditions." I thought about Ezra writing in his first ledger. The auctioneer laughed when I paid. I thought about 31 years of morning's temperatures recorded in small, precise handwriting, the same question asked again and again, with the patient certainty of a man who trusted that the answer existed, even when no one believed the question was worth asking. "Yes," I said, "on one condition." "What condition?" "His name comes first, every time it appears. Ezra Vance's name and what he discovered before anything about what I built." Keene nodded. "Of course." The monograph went out that summer to 3 academies and 2 engineering societies. By the following winter, Keene had letters of inquiry from colleagues in Pennsylvania and Ohio, and as far as Massachusetts, asking for further information about what the monograph called earth-sheltered thermal buffering, using natural limestone formations. The language was formal, and the audience was professional, and it was in its dry and technical way, the recognition that Ezra Vance had spent 31 years earning and had not lived to receive. His name was in print. His work was documented. The question he had spent his life asking had been answered, and the answer had been published, and the people who read it would know whose question it had been. Cormac Briggs died in the autumn of 1908. I found him on a Thursday morning in October, sitting in the chair on the cabin porch that he had taken to occupying in the mild fall weather when his lungs allowed him outside. The bowl of bean soup I had brought up from the kitchen the previous evening was still on the small table beside him, stone cold untouched. He was sitting with his hands folded in his lap, the large lime-whitened hands that had taught me to split a post and set a beam and mix mortar to the right consistency, and he looked peaceful in the way that people look peaceful when they have finished everything they needed to do. I stood on the porch for a long time before I went inside to get a blanket. I buried him on the ridge above the bluff on the south-facing slope, where the morning light struck first and stayed longest. I planted mountain thyme on the grave. It grew wild on the upper slopes and came back every year without being asked, and I drove his trowel into the earth at the head of the mound, handled down the blade up because he had told me once that a stonemason should be buried with his tools. He left me a letter with his cabin